The incessant sound of tennis balls bouncing against the newly installed asphalt was the last thing David Thompson expected to hear when he returned home after 3 months of cancer treatment at Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York. His return to Greenwich, Connecticut, should have been marked by the peace and quiet necessary for his recovery. Instead, he was greeted by a surreal scene that made his stomach churn more than any chemotherapy session. Where once there had been a 200 square meter vacant lot, his private property that he intended to turn into a therapeutic garden, now stood a professional tennis court, complete with bleachers, lighting system, and a high fence that seemed to mock his existence. The sound of applause and excited chatter echoed around the place, as if his backyard had been transformed into a country club without his knowledge or consent. "Welcome back, David." The falsely sweet voice of Alice Richards, his 52-year-old neighbor and current president of the Greenwich Heights Homeowners Association, cut through the air like a knife. "I hope you appreciate the improvements we've made to your property." David, still leaning on his cane and visibly shaken by the treatment, looked incredulously at the approaching woman wearing a set of sneakers that probably cost more than his last round of medication. "Alice, what the hell is that?" "That, dear, is the new Greenwich Heights Tennis Center. You should thank me. The value of your property has practically doubled." Alice adjusted her designer sunglasses, her artificial smile never faltering. The scene attracted the attention of other residents. Among them was Marcus Rodriguez, a retired lawyer who lived 2 houses down and who had always been suspicious of Alice's authoritarian tactics in the HOA. He watched the situation from his balcony, his expression a mixture of concern and indignation. "You had no right," David managed to say, his voice shaking with anger and exhaustion. "This is my land, my property." "Oh, but we did," Alice retorted, pulling a sheaf of papers from her Louis Vuitton bag. "During your absence, the HOA board voted unanimously to use the idle space for the benefit of the community. It's all here, perfectly legal." David felt his legs go weak, and Marcus quickly approached to offer support. "This is complete nonsense, Alice," the retired lawyer intervened. "You know very well that the HOA has no authority to seize private property." The discussion was interrupted by the sound of cars arriving. A small caravan of luxury SUVs parked next to the court, and several players in Greenwich Elite Tennis Club uniforms began to disembark, carrying professional equipment. "Ah, perfect!" Alice clapped her hands with artificial enthusiasm. "The regional tournament is about to start. David, about the $2 monthly maintenance fee. We can discuss it later. I'm sure you understand that a facility of this caliber requires constant care." David staggered, feeling dizzy. This was not the homecoming he had imagined during his long nights in hospital. While he was fighting cancer, dreaming of his therapeutic garden project that would help other recovering patients, his neighbor had turned his plans into a Kafkaesque nightmare. Marcus held David's arm firmly. "Let's go inside. You need to rest. And Alice?" He turned to the woman with a stern look. "I suggest you prepare your legal defense. It won't stay that way." That night, lying in his bed and unable to sleep due to the court lights coming through his curtains and the constant noise of the matches, David received an unexpected visitor. Christina Park, a young journalist from the Greenwich Times, had been alerted to the situation by Marcus. "Mr. Thompson," Christina said, her notepad already in hand, "your story needs to be told. What Alice Richards and the HOA have done here is more than a violation of property. It's an abuse of power that is becoming all too common in our city." David watched through the window as the shadows of the players moved under the artificial lights. on his lot, on his property, feeling a growing determination replace his initial weariness. "You know, Christina, I've spent the last 3 months fighting for my life. I've learned that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how difficult they may seem." Marcus, who had returned to check on David, added, "And you're not alone in this fight. Alice Richards may have the money and the influence, but she made a crucial mistake. She underestimated the strength of a community united against injustice." As the three of them talked late into the night, planning their legal and media strategy, the sound of tennis balls continued to echo around the estate as a constant reminder of the battle that was only just beginning. David Thompson had survived cancer and was now preparing for another fight, one that not only involved his property, but the fundamental principles of justice and dignity that formed the basis of any true community. Christina Park wasted no time in turning David Thompson's story into a Greenwich Times headline. "Cancer survivor returns home to find illegal tennis court on his property." The news spread like wildfire through the community of Greenwich, Connecticut, generating a wave of indignation that not even Alice Richards, with all her influence, could ignore. Marcus Rodriguez spent the next few days immersed in legal documents in his private library, preparing a solid legal strategy. His wife, Diana, a former oncology nurse, dedicated herself to helping David with his recovery, ensuring that the stress of the situation didn't compromise his fragile health. "I found something interesting," Marcus announced during an impromptu meeting in David's living room. "Alice violated not only state property laws, but also city regulations on unauthorized construction. The HOA approval she claims to have is completely invalid." David, sitting in his favorite armchair, watched the constant movement on the court through the window. The Greenwich Elite Tennis Club had expanded its opening hours, and now the lights stayed on until after midnight. "How did she manage to build all this in just 3 months?" he asked, his voice betraying exhaustion. "Money and connections," replied Christina, who had become a constant presence in the investigation. "I found out that Alice's husband, Robert Richards, is a majority shareholder in Richards Construction. They completely ignored the municipal approval process." The doorbell rang, interrupting the conversation. It was Patricia Martinez, a resident of the neighborhood whom David barely knew, carrying a briefcase full of documents. "Sorry to intrude," she said, "but I thought you guys needed to see this. These are records from the last 5 HOA meetings. Alice has been manipulating the minutes and forging signatures for months." Patricia, as secretary to the city council, had access to information that proved a pattern of questionable behavior on Alice's part. She's been doing this with other properties, too. 3 families have been forced to move in the last year due to fabricated violations of HOA rules. The group was interrupted by a commotion from outside. A delivery truck was trying to pass through the street, now constantly congested with cars of tennis players. The driver honked incessantly, while members of the club ignored his protests. "This has to stop," David declared, trying to get up. Diana gently made him sit down again, reminding him of his current physical limits. "And it will end," Marcus assured him. "Tomorrow we'll file an emergency injunction. But we need more than legal action. We need to expose Alice publicly." Christina smiled, her journalistic instincts sharp. "I'm already working on it. I found out that the Greenwich Elite Tennis Club is charging monthly fees and holding tournaments with cash prizes, all on private property, without a business license or the owner's permission." The meeting was interrupted by firm knocks on the door. Alice Richards was standing on the threshold, her normally controlled face now contorted with anger. "I've come to personally deliver your first maintenance invoice," she announced, holding out an envelope. and also to notify you that the HOA board voted for an additional $5,000 fine for landscaping neglect during your absence." Before David could respond, Patricia stood up. "Interesting, Alice. Considering that there hasn't been an official council meeting in the last 2 weeks, I should know, since I'm responsible for recording all of them." Alice's face paled slightly, but she kept her posture. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, David. This community needs order, standards. Your derelict lot was a disgrace to Greenwich Heights." "No, Alice," Marcus interjected, his voice calm but firm. "You're the one who has no idea. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., our request for an injunction will be filed. At 10 a.m., Christina's story will be published. And at 11 a.m., the city inspectors will be here to evaluate all the building code violations." Alice left, slamming the door, but not before everyone noticed the tremor in her hands. The group continued working into the night, preparing documents, collecting statements from other residents, and organizing evidence. The fight was just beginning, but for the first time since his return, David felt hope. That night, as the court lights continued to shine through his windows, David took out his cell phone and began recording a video. "My name is David Thompson," he began, "and this is my story. 3 months ago, I was fighting cancer. Today, I'm fighting something just as invasive: the greed and abuse of power that threatens not only my property, but the very values of our community." Christina, who was still present, immediately recognized the power of that testimony. "This is going viral," she whispered to Marcus. "It's exactly the kind of story people need to hear." Meanwhile, next door, Alice Richards was making frantic phone calls, trying to mobilize her allies. But the walls of her artificial kingdom were beginning to crumble. What she didn't know was that her next move would only accelerate her downfall, turning a property dispute into a case that would draw the attention of the entire nation. Christina Park's article in the Greenwich Times dropped like a bombshell in the community. Within hours, David Thompson's video went viral on social media, generating thousands of shares and a flood of outraged comments. The story of the cancer survivor who had his property usurped by a tyrannical HOA struck a sensitive nerve in the national consciousness. Alice Richards, however, was not one to accept defeat easily. The morning after the story was published, a team of lawyers from the law firm Prescott and Associates occupied her living room, developing strategies to contain the damage. Among them was Jeremy Prescott, a corporate lawyer known for his record of winning controversial cases. "We need to change the narrative," Prescott declared, adjusting his silk tie. "Let's present this as a community revitalization initiative. David Thompson is the villain here, a negligent homeowner who abandoned his property, forcing the community to take action." Meanwhile, at David's house, Marcus received an unexpected call. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Michelle Warren from the National Homeowners' Rights Association. We'd like to offer our full legal assistance in the Thompson case." The news brought a smile to David's tired face. The NPHA was known for its work in fighting abuses of HOAs across the country. With their support, the chances of victory increased considerably. However, Alice had other plans. That afternoon, a construction crew arrived at the tennis court, starting to install higher railings and security cameras. "It's a matter of public safety," she declared to the local press cameras. "We can't allow vandals to damage such a valuable community space." Christina, who was still covering the story, noticed something strange about the new building work. "David," she called out, showing some photos on her cell phone. "They're expanding the structure. Look at these markers on the ground. They're planning to build a clubhouse. The situation reached a new level of tension when Patricia Martinez discovered that Alice had secretly submitted a petition to the city council to redesignate the area as a commercial zone. She's trying to legalize the occupation retroactively, Marcus explained, studying the documents. It's a clever tactic, but also a desperate one. The community began to divide. While many residents supported David, others, especially those who benefited from the new sports facilities, defended Alice. The Greenwich Elite Tennis Club organized a protest outside David's house, with members holding placards accusing him of selfishness and elitism in reverse. Diana Rodriguez, concerned about David's health, urged him to rest. "You're still recovering," she reminded him, checking his vital signs. "Let us take care of the heavy lifting." But David had other plans. With Christina's help, he began researching the history of the Greenwich Elite Tennis Club. What they discovered was surprising. The club had been involved in similar scams in other upmarket neighborhoods, always taking advantage of the properties of vulnerable or absent people. "It's a pattern," Christina explained during an emergency meeting. "They identify target properties, make deals with local HOAs, and establish facilities without authorization. When homeowners protest, they're intimidated or sued until they give up." The most shocking revelation came from a former employee of the club, who reached out to Marcus anonymously. Robert Richards, Alice's husband, was not just a builder. He was one of the club's main investors. The tennis court scam was not just an abuse of power by the HOA, but a calculated business operation. "This changes everything," Marcus declared, reorganizing his legal strategy. "It's no longer just a question of ownership, but of organized fraud." As the evidence piled up, other homeowners began to speak out. In Westport, New Canaan, and other affluent Connecticut communities, similar stories emerged. The scam was bigger than anyone realized. Alice, feeling the siege closing in, made one last, desperate attempt. Through her lawyers, she offered to buy David's property for well above market value. "Think about it, Mr. Thompson," Jeremy Prescott argued during an unsolicited visit. "You could move anywhere, have a comfortable retirement." David, though exhausted and still struggling with the side effects of his treatment, stood firm. "My property is not for sale," he replied, "especially not to people who think they can take what they want by force." The tension reached its peak when, during a particularly noisy evening tournament, one of the floodlights on the court caused a small fire due to faulty wiring. The Greenwich Fire Department was called, and the subsequent inspection revealed multiple safety violations. "This has to stop now," declared Fire Chief Stephen Morrison, ordering the immediate closure of the facility. This structure poses a clear risk to public safety. For Alice Richards, it was the beginning of the end. As the court lights went out for the first time in weeks, David watched from his bedroom window, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. The battle was far from over, but now the truth was beginning to come out, and with it, the hope of justice. Christina, finishing her notes for another report, looked at David with admiration. "You know what's ironic? Alice wanted to turn her land into an exclusive club, but she ended up bringing the community together in a way that no tennis court could." Marcus added, "And that's just the beginning. What we've discovered here goes far beyond Greenwich Heights. It's time to expose the whole scheme." The Thompson versus Richards case quickly became a national phenomenon when CNN sent a team to Greenwich to cover the story. Veteran reporter Michael Santos was particularly intrigued by the wider ramifications of the scheme uncovered by Christina Park. "What we have here," Santos explained during a live broadcast in front of David's property, is potentially one of the largest real estate grabbing schemes ever uncovered in high-end communities on the East Coast. The presence of the national media provoked a chain reaction. Former employees of the Greenwich Elite Tennis Club began coming forward with new revelations. Amanda Foster, the club's former finance manager, handed Marcus a folder full of compromising documents. Robert Richards wasn't just building illegal courts, Amanda explained during a private meeting with Marcus and the NPHA legal team. He was using the club to launder money from a much larger property-grabbing scheme throughout the New England region. Meanwhile, Alice Richards was trying to keep up appearances. She organized a charity cocktail party on the tennis court, inviting the local elite to celebrate the community spirit of Greenwich Heights. The event, however, was interrupted when FBI agents showed up with search and seizure warrants. "Ms. Richards," announced Special Agent Catherine Morrison, "we need you to come with us for some clarification on certain financial transactions." The sound of champagne glasses breaking echoed around the court as the guests watched Alice being escorted out, her normally composed face now a mask of panic. Robert Richards, who was on a business trip in Palm Beach, was simultaneously detained by Florida police. David watched everything from his balcony, accompanied by Diana Rodriguez, who continued to monitor his recovery. "I never imagined that my personal struggle would reveal something so big," he commented, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Christina, who had arrived with new information, sat down next to them. "The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity," she explained. They would identify the properties of vulnerable people, the elderly, the sick, the long-term absentees, and use the local HOAs as a front for their operations. The tennis courts were just the tip of the iceberg. The investigation revealed a complex network of front companies, all connected to Richards Construction and the Greenwich Elite Tennis Club. In each affected community, the pattern was the same. HOA members were bribed, documents were falsified, and properties were effectively stolen from their rightful owners. Patricia Martinez, working tirelessly in the municipal archives, discovered something even more disturbing. They had plans for the whole neighborhood, she revealed during an emergency community meeting. The tennis court was just the first phase. The ultimate goal was to force out the most vulnerable homeowners for a big real estate development project. Marcus Rodriguez, who had become a sort of unofficial leader of the movement against the Richards, organized a press conference on David's lawn. "What we've uncovered here in Greenwich Heights is not just an isolated case of abuse of power by an HOA," he declared. "It's a sophisticated criminal scheme that has victimized communities in 6 different states." The National Homeowners' Rights Association has begun coordinating class action lawsuits on behalf of all identified victims. Michelle Warren, its lead representative, has worked tirelessly to gather evidence and testimony. "Each story we uncover is more shocking than the last," Michelle shared with David during a visit. "Elderly people forced to move, families intimidated, properties invaded, all under the guise of community improvements. The impact on the lives of those involved has been profound. Alice Richards, after being released on bail, became a pariah in her own community. Her former allies in the HOA quickly distanced themselves, fearing legal implications. The Greenwich Elite Tennis Club, now under federal investigation, had its operations suspended at all locations. For David, who was continuing his recovery, there was a bittersweet irony in it all. "You know what's most surreal?" he commented to Christina during an interview. "I really planned to create something beneficial for the community on that land. A therapeutic garden where other cancer patients could find peace during their treatment." David's story inspired a wave of change. State legislators began proposing reforms to the laws regulating HOAs. Communities across the country began reviews of their local governance policies. The Thompson versus Richards case was becoming a turning point in the debate over property rights and limits on the power of neighborhood associations. Marcus, reviewing the evidence with his expanded legal team, smiled as he realized the scope of what they had discovered. Sometimes, he reflected, it takes someone like David, someone who refuses to be intimidated, even when he's at his most vulnerable, to expose something much bigger than himself. The tennis court, now silent and empty under court order, stood as a monument to greed and the abuse of power. But it had also become a symbol of resistance and the importance of community unity against injustice. Fall arrived in Greenwich, bringing not only the changing of the leaves, but also profound transformations in the community. The federal courtroom in New Haven was packed as Judge Harrison Blackwell banged his gavel, beginning the final hearing of the case that had become known nationally as the tennis court scam. Alice and Robert Richards, once towering figures in Greenwich society, were now cowering in their chairs next to their lawyers. The evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming. Forged documents, offshore accounts, testimony from dozens of victims in 6 different states. "Your Honor," began federal prosecutor Andrea Simmons, "what we have here is not just a case of trespassing. It's a systematic criminal scheme that victimized entire communities, taking advantage of people in their most vulnerable moments." David Thompson, sitting between Marcus Rodriguez and Christina Park, watched the proceedings with mixed emotions. His hair had started to grow back, and his oncologist had recently confirmed that he was in remission. The prosecutor projected a series of slides showing the scope of the scheme. The Richards, through the Greenwich Elite Tennis Club and several shell companies, orchestrated an operation that moved more than $50 million in illegally acquired property over the past 5 years. Amanda Foster, the club's former financial manager, was the first witness of the day. Her voice trembled slightly as she described how the Richards couple manipulated local HOAs, bribed city officials, and intimidated homeowners. "They had a system," Amanda explained. "They would identify properties of people who were sick, elderly, or absent. They used the HOAs as legal cover for their actions. The tennis court was just the first phase. Then came the exorbitant charges, the fabricated fines, the constant pressure until the owner gave up and sold for a fraction of the value." Christina, who continued to cover the case for the Greenwich Times, now in partnership with the New York Times, was typing furiously on her laptop. Her series of reports on the scam had been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. The Richards defense tried to argue that it was all just misunderstandings and legitimate administrative decisions by the HOAs. But then came the moment that changed everything. The playback of a secret recording made by Patricia Martinez during a private HOA meeting. "We need to force these problem homeowners out," Alice's voice echoed through the room. "Use whatever it takes. Fines, infractions, intimidation. I don't care. Robert has interested buyers all over the block." Alice's face paled as she heard her own voice. Robert, her husband, dropped his head between his hands. Jeremy Prescott, her lead attorney, began scribbling frantically on his notepad. Michelle Warren, from the NPHA, presented documents showing similar patterns in other affected communities. "This case will set a crucial precedent for the protection of homeowners' rights across the country," she declared. After hours of testimony and arguments, Judge Blackwell was ready to announce his decision. The silence in the room was palpable. "This court," he began, "has rarely seen a case that demonstrated such blatant disregard not only for the law, but for human dignity itself. The defendants didn't just violate property rights. They systematically took advantage of people in their most vulnerable moments." The sentence was severe. Robert Richards received 15 years in federal prison, and Alice 12 years, in addition to substantial fines and restitution orders to the victims. The Greenwich Elite Tennis Club was dissolved, its assets frozen to compensate the victims. But the impact of the case went beyond the criminal sentences. The Connecticut state legislature passed the Thompson Act, legislation that set stricter limits on the powers of HOAs and additional protections for homeowners. Weeks later, David was on his land, now cleared of illegal structures, overseeing the start of construction on his dream therapeutic garden. Marcus and Diana Rodriguez, Christina, Patricia, and dozens of other community members had volunteered to help. "You know what's amazing?" David commented to Christina as they watched volunteers planting the first trees. "Alice wanted to turn this place into a symbol of exclusion and privilege. Instead, it has become an example of healing and togetherness." The Thompson Therapeutic Garden, as it came to be known, quickly became a haven not just for cancer patients, but for anyone seeking peace and renewal. Garden benches were installed with commemorative plaques honoring other victims of the Richards scam who had come forward. The new HOA board, now led by Patricia Martinez, has established clear and transparent guidelines with an emphasis on community participation and respect for individual rights. The Thompson v. Richards case became study material in law schools, a powerful reminder of the dangers of abuse of power and the importance of community vigilance. On a quiet fall afternoon, while David led a group of cancer patients in a meditation session in the garden, Christina was finishing her last article on the case. "True power," she wrote, "lies not in dominating others, but in uniting people for a greater cause." In Greenwich Heights, an attempted illegal appropriation inadvertently created something far more valuable: a truly united community, determined to protect its most vulnerable members. Marcus, watching from his makeshift office on the deck of his house, smiled as he saw the movement in the garden. The case that had begun as a battle over property had turned into something much bigger, a redefinition of the meaning of community and justice.